She arrived barefoot at a widower's farm, and he did something no one expected. He knelt, measured her feet with a strip of fabric, and ordered the saddler to craft a pair of genuine leather shoes. Can you imagine what it means to receive dignity when all you've known for days is despair and pain? But this story happened in rural Georgia in August 1928, when a simple gesture changed the destiny of two souls marked by loss. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. Write down your city and state or country. I love knowing that these stories from the old days reach so many different places. And if you're enjoying this, hit that like button so more people can discover this incredible story. Now let's get into it. Helen Carter's feet were bleeding when she first spotted the gates of Cedar Ridge Farm. It was 3 in the afternoon on a scorching Sunday in August, and she had walked for 3 whole days along the red clay roads that cut through the countryside. Her bare feet left small dark stains on the dusty ground, a mixture of dried blood and earth that accumulated with every step. She was 20 years old, but in that moment she seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime on shoulders bowed by exhaustion. Helen stopped before the tall, carved wooden gates that cast long shadows over her. Her hands trembled as she leaned against the fence post, trying to catch her breath. The blue calico dress she wore, the only thing she owned now, was torn at the hem and covered in dust. Her brown hair, which her mother used to brush with such care, fell in disarray over her shoulders. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the hot sun on her back and the taste of salt on her cracked lips. The last time she had eaten anything substantial was over a day ago. The last time she had slept in a bed was almost a week ago. The smoke still lingered in her memory. Helen could smell it even there, miles away from the small homestead where she was born and raised. The fire had started in the dead of night on a Thursday, a windless night with no warning. She had woken to the acrid smell of burning wood and her father's desperate screams. When she managed to get out of the house, choking on the black smoke that filled every room, she saw the flames consuming everything with terrifying speed. The house, the small shed where they kept the tools, the vegetable garden her mother tended with such love, the coop where Helen gathered eggs every morning. Her father, Ray Carter, had run back into the burning house. His mother, Helen's grandmother Catherine, slept in the back room and had trouble moving due to an old injury. Helen could still hear her father's voice shouting that he'd be right back, that he'd get Grandma and get out quick. But the old timber structure, dried out by years of harsh sun, gave way with a deafening crash. The roof collapsed, sending up a cloud of embers that rose into the sky like sinister stars. Helen screamed until she lost her voice, tried to run in, but the heat was a solid wall pushing her back. Neighbors who had come to help held her back, stopping her from throwing herself into the flames. When the fire finally died down at dawn, there was nothing left. They found the bodies of Ray and grandmother Catherine among the smoking rubble. Helen's mother, Amelia, had managed to get out of the house, but the smoke she had inhaled during those desperate minutes had damaged her lungs irreversibly. She survived 3 days on a makeshift bed in a neighbor's house, coughing up blood and whispering words Helen couldn't understand. On Monday morning, Amelia held her daughter's hand with surprising strength, for someone so weak looked into green eyes that were identical to her own, and said just 2 words before closing her eyes for the last time. "Find Augustus." Helen didn't understand immediately. Her mind was clouded by grief, exhaustion, and the shock of losing everything and everyone in a matter of days. But later, when the neighbors passed the hat around to bury the 3 bodies in the small village cemetery, an elderly lady explained. Augustus Hawthorne was the owner of Cedar Ridge Farm, the largest estate in that region. Helen's father, Ray, had worked there for many years as a foreman before managing to buy his own patch of land to try for an independent life. That was almost 15 years ago, But Ray always spoke well of his old boss. He said Augustus was a just man who paid on time and treated his hands with respect. With only the clothes on her back and a few coins the neighbors gave her out of pity, Helen made the hardest decision of her life. She had no living relatives. She had nowhere to go. She had nothing but the memory of her mother's last words. Find Augustus. So she began to walk. Cedar Ridge Farm was a 3-day journey on foot, following the roads that cut through cotton fields and open pastures where cattle grazed lazily under the sun. Helen walked the entire first day without stopping, driven by an almost furious determination. She couldn't crumble. She couldn't give up. She needed to survive, if only to honor the memory of those she lost. On the second day, her feet began to bleed. The old shoes she was wearing on the day of the fire had been left behind, lost in the confusion. She was barefoot, and the red clay road was merciless. Sharp stones, twigs, the heat of the ground under the midday sun. Helen felt every wound opening on the soles of her feet, but she kept walking. She stopped only to drink water from a creek and rest for a few hours under a shade tree. Hunger was a constant presence, a dull ache in her stomach she tried to ignore. She managed to eat some wild berries she recognized from when her mother taught her about plants, but it wasn't enough. On the third day, Helen was at her limit. Every step was agony. Her feet were bleeding openly now, leaving marks on the ground. The dizziness from hunger made her stumble occasionally. The sun seemed crueler, more unforgiving. But then, in the middle of the afternoon, she saw the gates. Grand, imposing, with the name Cedar Ridge Farm carved into a dark wooden plaque. Helen felt something break inside her. She didn't know if it was relief, hope, or simply the last remnant of strength slipping away. She had arrived. Now she just needed to find the courage to knock on that gate and ask for help. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders as much as exhaustion allowed, and pushed the gate, which thankfully wasn't locked. It groaned on rusty hinges, opening to reveal a driveway lined by the massive cedar trees that gave the farm its name. Their branches formed a shaded corridor, and Helen felt a bit of relief stepping out of the scalding sun. The main house appeared at the end of the lane. It was a sprawling 2-story structure, with whitewashed walls and a dark, shingled roof. Wide porches wrapped around the first floor, with carved wooden columns and empty rocking chairs. There were flowers planted in well-tended beds around the house, and Helen could see barns, corrals, and smaller tenant houses in the distance. She climbed the porch steps slowly, every movement a torture for her wounded feet. The main door was solid oak with wrought iron details. Helen raised a trembling hand and knocked 3 times. The sound echoed on the other side, and then there was silence. She waited, feeling her heart beat out of rhythm. Maybe no one was home. Maybe she had come all this way for nothing, but then she heard footsteps approaching, firm and measured. The door opened to reveal a tall man with broad shoulders. Augustus Hawthorne was 38 years old, but he looked older. His black hair was graying at the temples, and there were deep lines around his brown eyes that suggested constant worry or ancient sadness. He wore thick work trousers and a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing tanned, strong forearms. His eyes swept over Helen from head to toe, and she saw his expression change from curiosity to concern when he noticed the state she was in. Helen tried to speak, but her voice came out hoarse and weak. "Is your name Augustus Hawthorne?" she managed to say. He nodded slowly, furrowing his brow slightly. "Yes, that's me," he replied in a deep, calm voice. "Miss, you need help." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Helen felt her eyes sting with tears she refused to shed. "My father was Ray Carter," she said. "He worked here many years ago." Augustus stood motionless for a moment, and then something lit up in his eyes. "Ray," he repeated. "I remember him. He was one of the best foremen I ever had. An honorable man. How is he?" The question was like a knife to Helen's chest. She swallowed hard, fighting to maintain her composure. "He died," she said simply. "There was a fire at our house. My father, my grandmother, and my mother. Everyone is gone. I have no one left. I have nowhere to go." The words came out in a desperate rush, and Helen felt shame burn her cheeks. She was there, a stranger begging for charity from a man who barely remembered her father, but she had no choice. It was this, or starve on the road. Augustus remained silent for a few seconds that felt like eternity. Helen saw something pass through his eyes, a shadow of understanding, or perhaps compassion. Then he took a step back and opened the door completely. "Come in," he said firmly. "Let's take care of this." Helen hesitated. Her legs were shaking so much she wasn't sure she could take another step, but Augustus extended his hand, a simple and direct gesture, and she accepted it. His hand was large, calloused, warm. He held hers firmly and helped her up the last step into the house. The interior was cool and quiet. Helen had a quick impression of dark wood furniture, walls with paintings, a wide hallway with hardwood floors. But then her legs finally gave way. Augustus caught her before she fell completely, supporting her weight with ease. "Careful," he said. "When was the last time you ate?" Helen tried to remember, but her mind was foggy. "Yesterday, I think," she murmured. "Or the day before." "Marie." He made a sound of disapproval in his throat and guided her to a chair in the parlor. "Sit here," he ordered gently. "Don't move." He disappeared through a side door, and Helen heard muffled voices. Seconds later he returned, followed by a middle-aged woman with a stern face and a white apron. "This is Mrs. Higgins," explained Augustus. "She looks after the house. She'll bring food and water. Mrs. Higgins looked at Helen with an expression that mixed pity and suspicion, but she nodded and returned to what was presumably the kitchen. Augustus pulled up a chair and sat in front of Helen. His eyes were at her level now, and there was something in them she couldn't decipher. "Tell me what happened," he asked. And Helen told him. With a voice still weak and broken, she described the fire, the loss of her family, the 3 days of walking to get there. Augustus listened without interrupting, and when she mentioned her mother's last words, he closed his eyes briefly as if he felt her pain. "I am so sorry," he said when she finished. "Your father was a good man. He deserved a better end. They all did." Helen just nodded, unable to speak. Mrs. Higgins returned with a tray containing a steaming bowl of soup, fresh bread, and a glass of water. "Eat slowly," advised Augustus. "Your stomach isn't used to it." Helen obeyed, holding the spoon with trembling hands. The soup was vegetable with chunks of meat, and it was delicious. She forced herself to eat slowly, even though she wanted to devour everything at once. Augustus sat there, watching in silence, and only when she had finished half the plate did he speak again. "You said you have nowhere to go," he began. Helen nodded, putting the spoon back in the bowl. She didn't want to look at him, ashamed of her situation. "There is always work on a farm," continued Augustus. "We can find something for you to do. There's a place to stay." Helen finally raised her eyes, and the gratitude she felt was so intense it almost hurt. "Thank you," she whispered. "I work hard. I promise you won't regret it." Augustus made a gesture dismissing the formalities. "But first," he said suddenly, standing up, "you need shoes." Helen blinked, confused. "What?" "Shoes," he repeated. "You can't walk like that. Your feet are in terrible shape." It was then that Helen looked down and really saw her own feet for the first time since arriving. They were dirty, bruised, bleeding in several places. The skin was torn on the soles, and there were broken blisters that stung. She felt a wave of shame. "I don't have money to buy shoes," she admitted in a low voice. Augustus was already moving toward a desk in the corner of the room. He opened a drawer and took out a fabric measuring tape, the kind seamstresses use. "Come here," he said, and there was something in his tone that brooked no argument. Helen stood up unsteadily and walked to where he was. Augustus pulled out a chair. "Sit down," he asked. She obeyed, not understanding what he intended to do. And then, to her complete astonishment, Augustus Hawthorne knelt before her. The landowner, master of all those lands, boss to dozens of people, was kneeling on the floor in front of a barefoot girl covered in dust who had just shown up at his door. "Excuse me," he said, and with almost reverent care he held her right foot. Helen felt her face burn. "You don't need to do this," she protested weakly. "I can—" "Stay still," he interrupted without harshness. "I'm just measuring." His hands were surprisingly gentle, considering his obvious size and strength. He extended the tape measure along her foot, from heel to toe, and memorized the number. Then he did the same with the width. Helen was paralyzed, torn between embarrassment and something else she couldn't name. No one had ever touched her feet like that, with such attention and delicacy. When he finished with the right foot, he repeated the process with the left. Helen noticed he frowned slightly, seeing the injuries closer up, but he made no comments. Finally, he stood up and put the tape measure in his pocket. "Done," he said. "I'm going to have Theodore make a pair of leather shoes for you. He's the best saddler I know. They'll be ready in a few days." Helen stared at him in disbelief. Leather shoes were expensive, custom-made by craftsmen. They weren't something given casually to a stranger. "But I can't pay," she began. Augustus raised a hand, interrupting. "I'm not asking for payment," he said. "Consider it a gift. In memory of your father, who was loyal while he worked here." Helen felt the tears finally spill over. She tried to hold them back, but it was too late. They ran down her dirty cheeks, leaving clean tracks. "Thank you so much," she managed to say between sobs she could no longer control. "You don't know what this means." Augustus seemed uncomfortable with her emotion. He looked to the side, out the window overlooking the fields, and there was something in his expression suggesting he understood more than he let on. "We all need help sometimes," he said simply. "There is no shame in that. Now let's take care of those wounds and find a place for you to rest." He called Mrs. Higgins again and asked her to bring warm water, clean cloths, and the first aid kit. The housekeeper returned carrying the items, but this time there was less suspicion in her eyes when she looked at Helen. Augustus instructed Mrs. Higgins to help Helen wash her feet and apply a salve to the wounds. While the woman worked with silent efficiency, Augustus stepped out for a few minutes. Helen heard his deep voice outside, talking to someone. When he returned, he brought with him an elderly man with a stooped back and work-stained hands. "This is Theodore," introduced Augustus. "He's going to make your shoes." Theodore had completely white hair and faded blue eyes that seemed to have seen many things. He looked at Helen with a kind expression and nodded. "Miss," he said in a raspy voice, "I'm gonna make the best pair of shoes I ever made. Genuine leather, double-stitched. They'll last for years if you take care of them." Helen could barely speak. "Thank you," she whispered. Theodore smiled, showing gaps in his teeth. "It's an honor," he said. "Been a while since I made shoes for a lady. I'll make 'em special." After Theodore left, Augustus showed Helen to one of the tenant houses that was empty. It was a simple one-room structure, with wooden walls and a thatched roof, but it was clean and had a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a wood stove. "You can stay here," said Augustus. "Tomorrow we'll talk about what kind of work you can do. For now, rest." Helen entered the small house and felt a relief so great it almost knocked her over again. A bed, a roof, safety. She turned to Augustus, who was still at the door. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly. "Why are you being so kind to me? You don't know me. You could have just sent me away." Augustus stood in silence for a moment, his brown eyes fixed on her. "Because I know what it is to lose everything," he said finally. "And because no one should have to walk 3 days barefoot just to find a little hope. Your father was a good man. That means you're probably a good person too. That's enough for me." With those words, he nodded and left, closing the door gently behind him. Helen stood alone for the first time in days. She looked around the simple cottage that was now hers, looked at her bandaged feet, felt the weight of exhaustion and pain finally catching up to her. She collapsed onto the bed and cried. She cried for the family she had lost, for the life that had ended, for the fear and the loneliness. But she also cried with relief, because despite everything she had survived, and because a stranger who owed her nothing had decided to extend dignity to her when everyone would expect him to offer only charity. That night, Helen slept for the first time in a week without nightmares of fire. She woke up with the sun coming through the small window and the sound of birds singing in the nearby trees. Her feet still hurt, but less than before. She got up slowly and looked out the window. The farm was waking up around her. She saw men walking toward the fields, heard the lowing of cows, the clucking of chickens. It was a symphony of normal life she thought she'd never experience again. Someone knocked on the door. Helen opened it and found Mrs. Higgins standing there with a bundle of clothes in her arms. "The boss sent this for you, miss," said the woman, handing over the bundle. "There's 2 dresses, undergarments, and some socks. Said you should wear 'em till the shoes are ready." Helen took the clothes with reverence. They were used but in good condition, clean and carefully mended. Mrs. Higgins hesitated and then added in a lower voice, "His wife died 2 years ago. These were hers. He kept everything, but said she'd want someone to use them." The information landed on Helen like a weight. So, Augustus was a widower. That explained the sadness she had seen in his eyes, that shadow of loss she recognized because she carried her own. "Thank you," said Helen. "I'll take good care of them." Mrs. Higgins nodded and was about to leave when she turned back again. "He's a good man," she said unexpectedly. "Closed himself off after Miss Caroline passed. Doesn't talk much, doesn't smile, but he's got a good heart. Remember that." Helen changed clothes, wearing one of the dresses that had belonged to Augustus's late wife. It was thick, dark green cotton, simple but well made. It was a little loose on her, but nothing that couldn't be adjusted. She combed her hair the best she could with her fingers and pinned it in a low bun. When she left the cottage, the sun was already high. She didn't know exactly what to do, so she started walking toward the main house, thinking of finding Augustus and asking about work. But before she got there, she heard a child's voice. "Daddy, who's that lady?" Helen turned and saw a small child coming out from behind one of the sheds. It was a boy of perhaps 5 years, with messy dark hair and curious brown eyes. He wore short trousers and a cotton shirt, and there was a smudge of dirt on his cheek. Behind him came Augustus, walking with long strides. When he saw Helen, he stopped. "That's Helen," explained Augustus to the boy. "She's going to work here on the farm. Helen, this is my son Martin." The boy looked at Helen with unabashed interest. "You're pretty," he said with the brutal honesty of children. "My dad said you walked a long way to get here. Did your feet hurt?" Helen smiled for the first time in days. "They did hurt, yes," she confirmed, bending down to be at his height. "But your father is taking care of that. He's going to have new shoes made for me." Martin looked impressed. "Real shoes? From Mr. Theodore? He makes the best stuff. Made my belt. Look." And he proudly showed the tooled leather belt he was wearing. Helen felt something warm in her chest. "Very handsome," she praised sincerely. "You're lucky to have things so well made." Martin agreed vigorously and then asked without a filter, "Are you going to live here now?" Helen looked at Augustus, seeking guidance. He was watching the interaction with a soft expression she hadn't seen the day before. "For now, Yes, replied Helen to the boy. I'm going to help your father with the farm work. Can you teach me to read? Asked Martin suddenly. My dad knows how to read and said it's important, but he's always busy and doesn't have time to teach me right. Helen blinked in surprise. You want to learn to read? Martin nodded emphatically. I want to read the books in the parlor. My dad has lots. He said when I know how to read, I can read anyone I want. Helen looked at Augustus again. The man had an expression difficult to decipher. Do you know how to read? He asked. It wasn't an accusation, just curiosity. I do, replied Helen. My mother was a primary school teacher before she got married. She taught me since I was little. I can read, write, and do arithmetic. Augustus stood still for a moment, and then something changed in his expression. It was as if he had made a decision. Then that will be your job, he said. Teaching Martin. Every day, a few hours in the morning and afternoon. He needs to learn, and I really don't have the time to teach him properly. Helen felt a wave of relief so strong it almost knocked her over. Teaching was something she knew how to do. She had grown up watching her mother teach children to read, helped with many lessons. It was dignified work, important. I would love to, she said sincerely. I'll teach him everything I know. Martin cheered, jumping up and down, and Augustus placed a hand on the boy's head with clear affection. But there's one condition, added Augustus, looking at Helen. You eat at the main house with us, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You can't teach if you're weak from hunger. In the following days, Helen established a routine. She woke up early, washed in the cold water from the well behind her cottage, dressed, and walked to the main house. Mrs. Higgins always had coffee ready, a hearty meal with bread, butter, cheese, and coffee with milk. Augustus was usually already awake, drinking coffee in silence while reading old newspapers. Martin appeared shortly after, sleepy but excited. The lessons took place in the library, a room on the first floor of the main house that surprised Helen with the quantity of books. There were floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes, novels, history books, agriculture manuals, even some in French that Helen couldn't read but admired for their beauty. Martin was a dedicated student. He really wanted to learn, and Helen discovered she had a talent for teaching. She used methods her mother had shown her, making games with letters, drawing figures to illustrate words. Augustus passed by the library occasionally during lessons. He never interrupted, just stood in the doorway watching for a few minutes before heading to his chores. Helen felt the weight of that gaze, but not in an uncomfortable way. It was more like he was checking, making sure she was okay, that Martin was learning. Once she caught him watching and their eyes met. He didn't look away immediately. They stood there for a few seconds, looking at each other across the room, and then he nodded almost imperceptibly and walked away. On the fourth day, Theodore appeared at the main house after lunch, carrying a wooden box. Helen was on the porch with Martin, practicing writing vowels, when the old saddler climbed the steps. "Miss Helen," he called with a smile, "brought your gift." Helen felt her heart speed up. She opened the box with trembling hands and held her breath. The shoes were beautiful, made of dark brown leather, soft but sturdy, with perfect stitching and thick soles. Theodore had made them with obvious mastery, every detail cared for. There were even small decorative flourishes on the sides, discreet designs etched into the leather. "They're perfect," whispered Helen. "Try 'em on," encouraged Theodore. "Want to see if I got the measurements right?" Helen put the shoes on slowly. Her feet were still a bit sensitive from the wounds, but the shoes fit as if they had been made specifically for her, which, of course, they had been. She took a few steps on the porch, and the shoes were comfortable, didn't pinch or hurt. "They fit perfectly," she said, her voice choked up. "Thank you so much, Mr. Theodore. You are an artist." The old man blushed with pleasure. "Was a pleasure, miss. And look, I used the best leather I had. These shoes will last many years. You can walk in the rain, in the mud. They won't ruin easy. Martin asked to see and examined the shoes with childlike seriousness. They really are pretty, he declared. As pretty as my belt. Helen laughed, a sound that surprised even herself. How long had it been since she laughed? Thank you, Martin, she said. Coming from you, that's a big compliment. Augustus arrived at that moment, coming from the fields with clothes stained with dirt. He saw Helen wearing the new shoes and stopped. Did they turn out good? He asked. Helen nodded, suddenly feeling too emotional to speak. They turned out perfect, answered Theodore for her. The lady has delicate feet. Was easy to work the measurements. Augustus looked at the shoes for a long moment, and then his eyes rose to meet Helen's. Good, he said simply. Now you can walk without pain. There was something in that moment, something unspoken hanging in the air between them. Helen felt for the first time a strange sensation, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. It was the way he looked at her, as if he really saw her. Not just a needy person he had helped out of kindness or duty, but saw her for real, as Helen, as a complete person with her own life. And she realized she saw him too, saw the lonely man behind the facade of the busy rancher, saw the sadness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, saw the gentle way he touched his son's head, the care with which he chose his words. That night, after Martin went to sleep, and Helen was getting ready to return to her cottage, Augustus called her. She was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Higgins wash the dinner dishes, insisting on contributing in some way. Helen, he said from the doorway, can I speak with you a moment? Of course, she replied, drying her hands. She followed him to the library, where they had held class earlier. Augustus lit a lantern, since it was already getting dark. The soft light illuminated his face, highlighting the lines of fatigue. I wanted to thank you, he began. Martin is happy. He barely stops talking about the lessons. He's already recognizing letters. Helen smiled. He is a wonderful student, she said sincerely. Smart and dedicated. He'll learn fast. Augustus nodded, but there was something else he wanted to say. She could tell by the way he hesitated. I wanted to explain about the clothes, he said finally. The ones Mrs. Higgins brought. They were my wife's, Caroline. She died 2 years ago, in childbirth. Helen felt her heart squeeze. I'm so sorry, she said softly. You didn't need to tell me if it's painful. Augustus shook his head. No, you deserved to know. I kept her things for a long time. Couldn't part with anything. But when you arrived, I realized she would want someone to use them, that it made no sense keeping everything stored away when it could be useful. Helen didn't know what to say. It was a delicate moment, too intimate for someone he had known for only a few days. I'll take good care of them, she promised, and if someday it's too hard seeing me wearing them, you can tell me. I understand. Augustus looked at her then, really looked, and there was something in his eyes that made Helen's heart beat faster. It's not hard, he said quietly. Actually, it's comforting. Seeing life continuing, seeing someone using things with purpose and not letting it all turn into dusty memory. They stood there for a moment, the silence between them not uncomfortable, but charged with something neither of them was ready to name. Then Augustus cleared his throat and took a step back. It's late, he said. You must be tired. Helen nodded in agreement. Good night, Mr. Augustus. Just Augustus, he corrected. No need for formalities. She smiled shyly. Good night, Augustus. As she walked back to her cottage under the starry sky, wearing her new shoes that didn't hurt her feet, Helen realized something had changed. The pain of loss was still there, alive and pulsing. It would probably always be there to some degree. But for the first time since the fire, she felt something beyond the pain. She felt possibility. She felt that maybe, just maybe, life still held good things for her. She didn't know yet, as she opened the door of her cottage and lit her own lamp, that simple gesture of measuring her feet and ordering shoes made was just the beginning. She didn't know that Augustus was also in his big house, sitting alone in the library, looking at his own hands, and thinking for the first time in 2 years that maybe it was possible to feel something other than emptiness again. But the problems were just beginning. Because not everyone at Cedar Ridge Farm viewed Helen's arrival with kind eyes. And when a woman from the family arrived for a visit, bringing with her prejudices and expectations of her own, the fragile peace Helen had just found would be tested in ways she could never imagine. 3 weeks had passed since Helen arrived barefoot at Cedar Ridge Farm, and life was beginning to gain a rhythm she hadn't thought possible. She woke every morning with the sun rising over the fields, put on her leather shoes that were already starting to mold perfectly to her feet, and walked to the main house for coffee. Martin received her always with enthusiasm, showing drawings he had made trying to copy the letters she taught, and Augustus was always there, silent but present, with his coffee and his glances that lasted a second longer than necessary. The lessons with Martin expanded naturally. The boy already recognized all the letters and was beginning to form simple words. Helen discovered he had an impressive facility with numbers, so she started teaching basic arithmetic too. She used beans to count, drew problems on the small slate Augustus had bought especially for the lessons. The rancher appeared more and more frequently during the lessons, leaning against the doorframe watching. Sometimes he asked questions, testing his son's knowledge. Other times, he just watched Helen teach, and there was something in his look that made her blush without understanding exactly why. One morning in September, when the air was starting to cool, announcing the arrival of autumn, Helen was in the library organizing books by subject, as Augustus had asked. He had entered a few minutes before, carrying a stack of old volumes he'd found in the attic. "Might be useful for Martin in a few years," he explained. Helen took the books, her fingers brushing briefly against his during the transfer. It was minimal contact, accidental, but both froze for a fraction of a second before pulling away. Augustus cleared his throat. "You're doing a good job," he said. "With Martin, I mean. He's learning fast." Helen smiled as she put the books on the shelf. "He's very smart," she replied. "He has natural curiosity. That makes everything easier." Augustus approached, picking up one of the books to examine the worn cover. "He takes after his mother in that," he said quietly. "Caroline was curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked." It was the first time he mentioned his late wife so directly since that night in the library. Helen stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "She must have been a special woman," she said sincerely. Augustus nodded slowly. "She was. We married young. I was 23, she 19. Knew her since childhood. Our families were close. It was an arranged marriage on paper, but we got along. She made this house a home." Helen listened in silence, giving him space to talk. "When she died," continued Augustus with a raspier voice, "I felt like the color had gone out of the world. Everything went gray. Martin had just been born, and I didn't know how to take care of a baby. Mrs. Higgins helped me a lot back then. But I was lost. I spent 2 years just functioning, wake up, work, sleep, nothing more." He paused and then looked at Helen. "Until you arrived." Helen's heart raced. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Augustus held the book tighter, as if he needed something solid to anchor himself. "You brought life back," he said. "Martin's laughter, his excitement in the morning, and you made me realize there are still good things. That it's possible to feel something other than weight." Helen couldn't look away. There was so much sincerity in those brown eyes it hurt. "You gave me something too," she said before she could stop herself. When I arrived here, I was ready to give up. I had nothing. I was nothing. And you treated me like I mattered, like I was more than just another mouth to feed. You gave me dignity when you could have given me only work." Augustus took a step closer. "It wasn't charity," he said firmly. "It was recognition. I saw courage when I looked at you that day. I saw strength. Anyone can offer charity, but respect, that you offer only to those who deserve it." The moment stretched between them, charged and heavy. Helen felt as if she were on the edge of something immense, something that could change everything. But then they heard quick footsteps in the hallway, and Martin ran into the library. "Daddy!" "Would," he called without realizing what he interrupted. "Mr. Theodore said the mare had her foal. Can I go see? Can I show Helen?" The spell broke. Augustus blinked and stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "Of course," he said to his son. "Go show her. But don't get too close. The mother is still protecting the little one." Martin grabbed Helen's hand. "Come on, come see. He's tiny and has long legs." Helen let herself be pulled, but she looked back once. Augustus was standing where she left him, watching her go, with an expression she couldn't completely decipher, but that made something tighten in her chest. In the afternoon, after Martin got tired of watching the foal and went back to his writing lessons, Helen was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Higgins prepare dinner. The housekeeper was making dough for bread, and Helen was peeling potatoes. They worked in comfortable silence. A silence Mrs. Higgins broke unexpectedly. "He likes you." Helen almost dropped the potato. "What did you say?" Mrs. Higgins didn't look at her, continued kneading the dough with force. "The boss, he likes you. I see how he looks." Helen felt her face burn. "I don't know what you're talking about," she murmured. Mrs. Higgins made a sound that could be a laugh. "Miss, I have eyes. Been working in this house for 15 years. Saw the boss grow up, marry, lose his wife. I know all his expressions, and the way he looks at you is different." Helen didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to deny it, but it would be a lie. She had noticed it too. The glances, the careful words, the moments that seemed to mean more than they should. "I didn't come here for that," she said finally. "I came because I had no choice. He gave me work and a roof. I'm not going to presume anything beyond that." Mrs. Higgins finally looked at her, and her eyes were kind. "No one is saying you're presuming, girl, just saying what I see. And I see two wounded hearts recognizing each other. If you like him too," continued Mrs. Higgins, "there's nothing wrong with that. Miss Carolyn is gone. He's alive and has the right to be happy again. And you too." Helen swallowed hard. "It's complicated," she whispered. "He's my boss. He took me in when I had nothing. People will talk." Mrs. Higgins shrugged. "People always talk. But in the end, only what you two feel matters, and what God knows is in your hearts. The rest is noise. But if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any stories. Now let's continue. That night, Helen stayed awake for a long time in her cottage, looking at the thatched roof while thinking about Mrs. Higgins' words. Was it true? She felt something for Augustus. She barely knew him, just a few weeks. But there was a connection she couldn't deny. The way he had taken care of her from the first moment. The respect with which he treated her, the kindness with his son. And yes, the attraction she felt when he was near, that warmth in her chest when their eyes met. But Mrs. Higgins was wrong about one thing. It wouldn't just be people talking. There were real differences between them. He was an established rancher with property and a respected name. She was an orphan with nothing but the clothes he himself had given her. If something happened between them, there would always be those who said she took advantage, that she seduced the vulnerable widower to secure a position. Helen couldn't bear that. Not after everything. The following days were strange. Helen noticed Augustus was different, more distant. He still appeared during Martin's lessons, but stayed less time. He didn't dine in the main house with them anymore, claiming work he needed to finish. Helen wondered if he regretted that conversation in the library, if he had shown too much and was now retreating. The possibility hurt more than it should. It was on a Friday afternoon, when Helen was returning from a walk in the fields with Martin, that everything changed. They saw an elegant carriage coming up the cedar lane toward the main house. It was an expensive vehicle, pulled by two beautiful horses with gold details on the sides. "Who is it?" asked Martin curiously. Helen didn't know. They weren't expecting visitors that she knew of. When they got closer, they saw Augustus coming out of the house to receive the visitors. A middle-aged man got out of the carriage first and then helped a woman down. She wore a traveling dress in fine fabric, an elaborate hat with feathers, and carried a lace parasol. Even from a distance, Helen realized she was a person of means. The woman hugged Augustus familiarly, and Helen felt something unpleasant twist in her stomach. Martin suddenly tensed beside her. "It's Aunt Evelyn," he said softly, and there was something in his tone Helen didn't like. "She doesn't usually come here." Helen looked more closely. So this was Evelyn, Augustus's sister-in-law, sister of his late wife. Mrs. Higgins had mentioned her a few times, but always vaguely. Helen had noticed the housekeeper didn't like the woman, but never asked why. "Let's go in through the kitchen," suggested Helen. "Your father probably wants to receive visitors privately." Martin agreed quickly, looking relieved. They entered through the back door and found Mrs. Higgins in the kitchen, looking grim. "The witch has arrived," grumbled the housekeeper. Helen blinked, surprised by the term. Mrs. Higgins huffed. "Sorry, miss, but I don't have a better word for Mrs. Evelyn. She comes here and turns everything upside down, goes around giving orders, criticizing how I take care of the house, touching the late mistress's things. And the boss can't say no because she's his wife's sister." Helen felt a pang of apprehension. "Is she staying long?" she asked. Mrs. Higgins shrugged. "Depends. Sometimes stays days, sometimes weeks. Never know. Lives in Dallas with her daughter, but comes here when she wants. Says it's to see her nephew, but really it's to control everything." Helen absorbed the information in silence. She had a bad feeling about this. The feeling was confirmed at dinner. Augustus sent word that Helen should dine at the main house as usual, as the visitors wanted to meet her since she was teaching Martin. Helen put on her best dress, the other one that came in the bundle of clothes from the late Caroline, and pinned her hair with care. She felt nervous in a way she hadn't felt since she arrived. The dinner table was more formal than usual. Evelyn sat to the right of Augustus with her husband beside her. Helen was introduced and sat on the other side of the table, next to Martin. Evelyn was a woman of about 45, dark hair held in an elaborate style, face with sharp features. She wore jewelry on her neck and fingers, and there was something sharp in her eyes when she examined Helen from head to toe. "So you are Martin's teacher," said Evelyn, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Augustus told me. How convenient to have found someone literate just when he needed it." Helen smiled politely. "It was luck for both parties," she replied. "I needed work and shelter, and Martin needed someone to teach him." Evelyn took a sip of wine. "And you said your father worked here. How long ago?" Helen felt she was being tested. "Many years ago. He left about 15 years back to have his own property, but he always spoke with much respect of Mr. Augustus and the farm." Evelyn tilted her head. "And your parents, where are they now?" The question was asked with a casual tone, but Helen sensed the trap. "They passed away recently in a fire," she answered, keeping her voice steady. "That's why I came here. I had no family left or anywhere to go." "Ah, yes, the fire," said Evelyn with false compassion. "What a tragedy. Must have been terrible. And you arrived here with nothing, didn't you? Not even shoes on your feet, I heard." Helen felt her cheeks flush. "It's true," she confirmed, "but Mr. Augustus was very generous. He had shoes made for me and gave me honest work." Evelyn looked at Augustus with an expression Helen couldn't read. "Generous indeed," she commented. "Maybe too generous." The comment hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Augustus put his silverware on the table with more force than necessary. "Evelyn," he began in a warning tone. She raised her hands in a gesture of innocence. "I'm just commenting, Augustus. You've always been kind. It's one of your best qualities. But kindness can sometimes be interpreted wrongly." Evelyn's husband, Claude, remained silent, eating his food as if he didn't want to be there. Martin looked at his plate, uncomfortable. Helen decided to change the subject. "How is Dallas?" she asked Evelyn politely. "Must be very different from life in the country." Evelyn seemed surprised by the question, but answered, "It is growing rapidly. Lots of construction, lots of novelties arriving from Europe." "Have you been there?" Helen shook her head. "I never left the region where I was born much." Evelyn smiled condescendingly. "Must be hard then to imagine what it's like to live in a real city, with theatres and balls and refined society." The message was clear. Helen came from humble origins, had no formal education or experience with society. She was inferior. Helen kept her composure. "I imagine it is quite different," she agreed. "But I believe there is value in both ways of life. The country teaches things the city cannot." Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "What wisdom," she commented with thinly veiled sarcasm. "So young and already so philosophical." Augustus intervened firmly. "Helen is doing an excellent job with Martin. He is already reading simple words and doing math. He's far beyond what I expected for his age." Martin lifted his face, excited. "It's true, Aunt Evelyn. Helen teaches me with games and stories. It's really fun. Can I show you what I learned?" Evelyn smiled at her nephew with genuine affection. "Of course, dear, I would love to see. But maybe tomorrow? I am tired from the trip today." The rest of dinner was tense, but polite. Helen answered questions when asked, but didn't try to make conversation. She felt the weight of Evelyn's gaze on her constantly, evaluating, judging. When they could finally excuse themselves, Helen felt immense relief. She went back to her cottage under the dark sky and sat on the bed, trembling slightly. She knew an enemy when she saw one. The following days confirmed her suspicions. Evelyn was everywhere. She appeared at Martin's lessons, sitting down to watch with critical eyes. Made subtle comments about teaching methods, suggesting it might be better to hire a proper governess from Dallas, reorganized rooms in the main house, removing things Helen had touched and putting back items that belonged to Caroline. It was as if she were marking territory, erasing any trace that something new might be growing there. Helen tried to keep a respectful distance, but it was difficult. Evelyn created situations to humiliate her subtly. At one lunch, she commented that the dress Helen was wearing looked much better on Caroline because she had more feminine hips. On another occasion, she asked in front of Mrs. Higgins if Helen knew how to embroider and sew properly, as those were essential skills for any decent woman. When Helen admitted she knew only the basics, Evelyn sighed dramatically, saying it was a pity, since a woman without domestic skills had trouble finding a good marriage. Augustus was increasingly closed off. Helen saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided conflicts with his sister-in-law. It was obvious he didn't like her presence, but it was also obvious he felt obliged to tolerate her because of Caroline's memory. He barely spoke to Helen now, just nodded when they passed each other. The moments of connection they shared before Evelyn's arrival seemed to have happened in another life. It was on a Sunday morning that things escalated. Helen was in the library organizing books when she heard raised voices coming from Augustus's office down the hall. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the voices were too loud to ignore. It was Evelyn and Augustus arguing. "You don't see what she's doing," said Evelyn. "She arrived here with nothing, and now she's living in a house on your property, eating your food, wearing my sister's clothes. And you look at her in a way that—" Augustus's voice interrupted, low but firm. "In what way?" Evelyn paused. "Like you looked at Caroline." Helen felt her heart race. She shouldn't be hearing this. "You are seeing things that don't exist," said Augustus. "Helen is an employee. She takes good care of Martin, nothing more." Evelyn laughed without humor. "Augustus, I've known you since we were children. You don't fool me. You are letting yourself get involved, and she knows exactly what she is doing too." "Enough," said Augustus, with a hard voice Helen had never heard. "I will not hear you speak of Helen like that. She is an honest girl who went through a terrible tragedy. I gave her work because she had capacity and because it was a debt to her father's memory. Anything beyond that is your imagination." Evelyn lowered her voice, but Helen could still hear. "Caroline barely gone, and you are already replacing her. With a nobody with no family, no name, no nothing. My sister deserved more respect for her memory." The silence that followed was heavy. Then Augustus spoke with a voice that was too controlled. "I loved your sister, but she is not here anymore. I have a life to live and a son to raise. I won't stay trapped in eternal mourning just to satisfy your expectations, and Helen is not a nobody. She is an educated, kind, and hard-working woman. She has more dignity in one finger than many society people I know." Helen felt tears sting her eyes. No one had ever spoken of her like that, defended her with such conviction, but she also felt terrible guilt. She was causing problems, turning Augustus against his late wife's family. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. She hadn't come there for this. She made a decision. She waited until the voices in the office went quiet and then went back quickly to her cottage. She grabbed the small bundle where she kept her few possessions, the 2 changes of clothes she wasn't wearing, some books Augustus said she could borrow. She wrote a short note thanking him for everything and explaining she thought it best to leave. She didn't mention Evelyn, didn't blame anyone, just said she felt it was time to move on and that she would never forget his kindness. She was about to leave when she heard a scream coming from the main house. It was Mrs. Higgins' voice shrill with panic. "Boss, come quick, it's the boy!" Helen dropped the bundle and ran. She found Mrs. Higgins in Martin's room on the 2nd floor. The boy was in bed, pale as wax, shaking violently. His forehead was hot as a coal to the touch. Augustus arrived running right after, and his expression transformed into terror, seeing his son. "He was fine earlier," said Mrs. Higgins with a trembling voice. "Ate lunch normally. Then said he was tired and went to sleep. When I came to check, he was like this." Augustus touched his son's forehead and cursed softly. "He's burning up. I need to get Dr. Mendez in town. It'll take 2 hours at least." Evelyn appeared in the bedroom doorway. "What happened?" "Martin," said Augustus, already moving. "High fever. I'm going to get the doctor now." Helen heard herself speak before thinking. "I can help. My mother taught me about herbs and fevers. I can lower the temperature while you get the doctor." Augustus looked at her, and for the first time in days she saw the walls come down. There was pure desperation in his eyes. "Do you really know how?" Helen nodded firmly. "I do. My grandmother had a fever like this once. My mother nursed her, taught me what to do." Augustus didn't hesitate. "Do it," he asked. "Please, I'm going for the doctor. Take care of him." He ran out. Helen heard his heavy steps going down the stairs, the door slamming, horses being readied. She turned to Mrs. Higgins. "I need cold water, clean cloths, and if you have it in the kitchen, willow bark and mint leaves." Mrs. Higgins ran to get them. Evelyn stood in the doorway. "What are you going to do?" she asked suspiciously. Helen ignored the tone and started taking off Martin's heavy blanket. "I'm going to lower his fever before it causes seizures," she explained. "High fever can be dangerous in children. Need to lower it fast." Mrs. Higgins returned with the items. Helen dipped the cloths in the cold water and placed one on Martin's forehead, others on his neck and wrists. She started boiling the willow bark with mint leaves to make tea. While the water boiled, she changed the cloths constantly, keeping them cold. Martin moaned softly, delirious. Helen spoke to him in a soft voice, saying everything was okay, that she was taking care of him, that his father would be back soon. When the tea was ready, she waited for it to cool a bit and then helped Martin drink small sips. The boy was so weak he could barely swallow, but Helen was patient. One sip at a time. "Come on, Martin. It'll help you, I promise." Evelyn watched from afar, and for the first time there was no hostility in her look. There was something closer to reluctant respect. The hours dragged on. Helen didn't leave Martin's side for a minute. Continued changing the cloths, giving the tea in small doses, monitoring the temperature. Slowly, very slowly, she began to notice a change. Martin's skin wasn't so scalding anymore. The shivering lessened. He seemed to enter a more natural sleep than the feverish delirium. When Augustus finally returned with the doctor, it was already nightfall. He ran up the stairs, Dr. Mendez right behind. They found Helen sitting beside Martin's bed, exhausted but vigilant. The boy slept peacefully now, breathing normal, skin still warm but not dangerously so. Augustus stopped at the door, looking at his son, and then at Helen. "The fever?" he asked with a raspy voice. "It went down," replied Helen. "He's still a bit warm, but nothing like he was. Gave him willow bark tea and kept him cooled with cloths." Dr. Mendez approached and examined Martin with care, checking temperature, heart rate, looking at eyes and throat. Then he turned to Helen. "Miss did an excellent job," he said. "Saved this boy. Fever that high in a child this age can cause serious damage or worse, but he's out of danger now. We'll need rest and care, but he'll be fine." Augustus staggered slightly, leaning on the doorframe. He closed his eyes for a moment, and Helen saw his lips move in a silent prayer of gratitude. When he opened his eyes again, they were shining. "Thank you," he said, looking directly at Helen. "I don't have enough words. You saved my son." Helen felt the tears finally come. "I did what anyone would do," she said. "He is a special boy. Couldn't let anything happen to him." Dr. Mendez left instructions for care and departed. Mrs. Higgins stayed with Martin while he slept. Evelyn had retired silently to her room, and Helen, exhausted, started going down the stairs. But Augustus followed her. "Helen!" he called. She stopped but didn't turn around. He came down until he was beside her. "You were leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "I saw the bundle." Helen closed her eyes. "I saw I was causing problems," she admitted. "Your sister-in-law is right. My presence here complicates things. It's better I go before it gets worse." Augustus held her arm gently, turning her to face him. "No," he said firmly. "You are not going anywhere." Helen tried to protest. "But Evelyn is leaving tomorrow," interrupted Augustus. "I already decided. Told her she needs to return to Dallas. She can't stay here dictating how I should live my life." "But she's your wife's sister," said Helen. "Her family." "And she lives trapped in the past," replied Augustus. "Just like I lived for 2 years. But you showed me it's possible to live again, to feel again, and I won't let anyone, not even Evelyn, take that from me." Helen looked at him with tears running down her face. "I don't know what to say." Augustus raised a hand and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb, a gesture so tender she held her breath. "Don't say anything yet," he asked. "I know it's early. I know there is much to consider. But I want you to stay, not just as Martin's teacher. I want you here because when you are near, I feel alive again, and I hope, very much hope, that maybe you feel something similar." Helen couldn't speak, just nodded, and it was enough. Augustus smiled, the first time she saw a true smile from him, and it was beautiful. "Rest," he said. "You spent the whole night taking care of Martin. You need to sleep." Helen agreed and walked to her cottage, but this time she didn't take the bundle. Left it where it was, because now she knew she wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. Maybe never. Evelyn left the next day as Augustus promised. She said goodbye to Martin with genuine affection, but barely looked at Helen. As she got into the carriage, she turned to Augustus. "I hope you know what you are doing," she said. "I know exactly," he replied, "for the first time in a long time." The carriage left kicking up dust on the road, and Helen felt as if a huge weight had been lifted. In the days that followed, something changed between Helen and Augustus. There was less hesitation now, fewer walls. He started having dinner with her and Martin again. They talked about books, about the farm, about plans for Martin's lessons, and sometimes when they thought no one was looking, their eyes met and remained so for precious seconds, communicating things words couldn't yet say. Martin recovered completely, and his first question upon waking was if Helen was okay. She hugged him, feeling love for that boy who had become so special to her. And when Augustus witnessed the hug, something passed over his face that Helen recognized. It was hope. It was possibility. It was the beginning of something both feared to name but could no longer deny. But the challenges hadn't ended yet, because in a few weeks, news would arrive at the farm that would test everything they were starting to build. And Helen would have to make the hardest decision of her life, between the love that was beginning to bloom and the dignity she had fought so hard to regain. May brought the first frosts, and with them a change in the atmosphere of Cedar Ridge Farm. Helen woke up earlier now, lighting the wood stove in her cottage before the sun even rose to chase away the chill that penetrated the cracks. It had been 2 months since her arrival, and life had found a rhythm that seemed almost natural. The lessons with Martin advanced quickly, the boy already reading complete sentences and beginning to write small texts. And Augustus was increasingly present, not just as a boss or father of her student, but as something more neither of them yet had the courage to fully define. It was on a Saturday morning, when Helen was in the library organizing the books Martin had used during the week, that Augustus entered with an expression she couldn't decipher. He held a letter in his hand, and there was tension in his shoulders. "Helen," he said, closing the door behind him, "I need to talk to you about something important." Her heart sped up. "Of course," she replied, putting the books back on the shelf. "What happened?" Augustus approached, the letter still in his hand. "Received news from the courthouse in town, about the property where you lived with your parents." Helen felt her stomach churn, didn't expect to hear about that ever again. Tried to bury memories of the fire deep in her mind. "What about it?" she asked, with a voice weaker than she would like. Augustus hesitated. "The land is being auctioned to pay outstanding debts, back taxes your father owed. It's happening next week." Helen sat in one of the chairs, feeling her legs go weak. Knew her father struggled with money, that the last years had been hard with droughts and bad harvests, but didn't imagine there were debts. "I don't have money to pay," she said simply. "Neither to stop the auction nor to buy the land back. It's better to let it go. It was all that was left of my family, but it's no use now." Augustus knelt in front of her, getting to her eye level. "I can buy it," he said, "at the auction. Can acquire the property and give it back to you. It's small but has good soil. Could be yours." Helen stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you do that? You've already done so much for me. I can't accept more." Augustus held her hands between his, large and warm. "Because I want you to have something of your own," he explained. "Something no one can take away. You arrived here with nothing, and I hate the idea that you're still in that position. If you have property, you have security, have a future." Helen felt tears prickling, "But it would be your property, not mine. You would buy it. It would be charity again. It wouldn't be charity, said Augustus firmly. It would be an investment. You could work the land, plant what you wanted, or could just have it as collateral. Doesn't matter. What matters is, it would be yours. Helen pulled her hands back, standing up and walking to the window. Outside she saw the fields stretching to the horizon, the fertile land that belonged to Augustus. "And you don't understand," she said without turning around. "If I accept this, everyone will say I sold myself, that I seduced the rich widower to get property. I've already heard the whispers in town. When I go with Mrs. Higgins shopping, women whisper when I pass, say I arrived from nowhere and am already living on the farm, wearing the late mistress's clothes, taking care of the son as if I were family." Augustus remained silent for a moment that seemed eternal. Then he stood up and walked until he was behind her. Helen could feel his heat so close but without touching her. "And what do you want?" he asked low. "Not what people will say or think. What do you want?" Helen closed her eyes. It was an impossible question, because what she wanted and what she could have seemed to be completely different things. "I want dignity," she whispered. "I want people to look at me and see an honest woman who works hard, not an opportunist who took advantage of a man in mourning." "And me?" asked Augustus even lower. "What do you want from me?" The question hit her like lightning. Helen turned slowly to face him. They were so close she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the grey hairs at his temples, the way he looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "I can't want anything from you," she said. "It wouldn't be right." "Why?" he pressed. "Because you saved me when I had nothing. Any feeling I had would be contaminated by gratitude. How would you know if it's real?" Augustus raised his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but Helen didn't pull away. He touched her face gently, thumb caressing her cheek. "I know it's real," he said. "I've known since the day I measured your feet and saw courage in your eyes. Not pity, not just need. I saw strength. Saw a woman who walked 3 days barefoot because she refused to give up. And every day since then just confirmed what I felt in that moment." Helen felt a tear roll down. "But what about Caroline?" she whispered. "Your wife. You loved her." "I did," agreed Augustus, "and I will always have a place for her in my heart. She was the mother of my son, companion for years. But she is gone, Helen. And I spent 2 years dead inside, just existing, until you appeared and reminded me I'm still alive, that I can still feel, and what I feel for you doesn't diminish what I felt for Caroline. They are different things, in different times." Helen swallowed hard. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "of what people will say, of what it will mean, of ruining everything because I don't know how to do this." "I'm afraid too," confessed Augustus. "Afraid of not being enough. Afraid of hurting you. Afraid you stay only out of gratitude and wake up one day resentful. But I'm even more afraid of letting you go and spending the rest of my life wondering what could have been." Helen looked into his brown eyes and saw truth there. Not blind gratitude or obligation, but real connection. 2 people who found each other in the hardest moment and recognized something in one another worth protecting. "Then don't buy the property," she said finally. "At least not yet. I don't want it to be a grand gesture or sacrifice. If you feel what you say you feel, and if I feel what I think I feel, then we have time. We can figure it out together, slowly, without pressure from what people will say or what we owe each other." Augustus nodded slowly. "You're right. Let's go slow. But Helen, I want you to know one thing." He leaned closer, voice raspy. "I'm not doing this out of pity or obligation. I'm doing it because when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is seeing you. And when I lie down at night, I fall asleep thinking of your voice, your smile, the way you care for my son as if he were yours. That isn't gratitude. It's something much bigger. And then, slowly enough so she could refuse if she wanted, he leaned in and kissed her forehead. It was a chaste touch, respectful, but loaded with promise. Helen closed her eyes, feeling tears flow freely now. When he pulled away, she opened her eyes and for the first time allowed herself to imagine a real possibility of a future. Not a future built on obligation or rescue, but on choice. On wanting to be there, not because she needed to, but because she desired to. The days that followed were different. There was lightness now, tacit permission for the feelings that had been growing to exist without guilt. Augustus started appearing more in lessons, not just to observe, but to participate. Sat with Martin and Helen, helping with math problems or reading aloud. The boy noticed the change and was visibly happier. One afternoon he asked innocently if Helen could stay forever, and when she hesitated, it was Augustus who answered. "I hope so," he said, looking at Helen. "If she wants to." But peace wouldn't last. On a Wednesday afternoon, when Helen was returning from town after shopping with Mrs. Higgins, they saw a group of women talking in the square. When Helen passed, the conversation stopped. One of them, owner of a local boarding house named Sylvia, stared at her blatantly. "Is it true you're living at Cedar Ridge Farm?" she asked loud enough for everyone around to hear. Mrs. Higgins tried to pull Helen to keep walking, but Helen stopped. "It's true," she replied calmly. "I work there as Mr. Augustus's son's teacher." Sylvia exchanged significant glances with the other women. "Teacher," she repeated with a tone full of insinuation. "Is that what they call it now?" Helen felt her blood boil. "I don't know what you're talking about, ma'am," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I teach the boy to read and write. It is honest work." Another woman, older and dressed in black, spoke up. "Honest is arriving with nothing and in 2 months wearing fine clothes and living in a house on the property. Everyone knows those clothes were the late Miss Caroline's. Such speed in taking her place." Mrs. Higgins stepped forward. "Be careful what you say," she warned. "The girl hasn't done anything wrong." But the damage was done. Other people in the square were listening now, curious. Helen felt humiliation burn her cheeks, but refused to lower her head. "I lost my entire family in a fire," she said clearly. "I came to the farm because my father worked there years ago, and I had no one else. Mr. Augustus gave me work. That is all. If there is something wrong with accepting honest help when one is desperate, then condemn me. But don't invent stories that don't exist." She turned and walked away before they could respond, Mrs. Higgins running after her. When they got to the wagon, Helen was trembling. "Don't pay them no mind," said Mrs. Higgins with anger. "They're jealous gossips who have nothing better to do." But Helen knew it wasn't that simple. Gossip had power, could destroy reputations, ruin lives, and more importantly, could reach Augustus's ears and shame him in the community. That night, during dinner at the main house, Helen was quiet. Augustus noticed. "Did something happen?" he asked when Martin left the table to play. Helen hesitated, but then told him about the incident in town. Saw Augustus's jaw tighten as he listened. When she finished, he put the silverware aside. "I'm going to talk to those women," he said with controlled anger. "I'm going to make it clear I won't tolerate this kind of behavior." "No," said Helen quickly. "That will only make things worse. They'll say I'm making you defend me, that I have influence over you. It's exactly what they want to believe." Augustus looked at her frustrated. "Then what do you want me to do? Let them talk about you like that?" Helen took a deep breath. "I want us to stop hiding," she said. "If there is something between us, something real, then it shouldn't be a secret. But it also needs to be done the right way, with respect to your wife's memory and the community. It can't look like something sneaky or shameful." Augustus remained silent, considering. "You're right," he admitted finally. "But I won't let them mistreat you. You deserve respect." Helen felt her heart warm. "Thank you," she said softly, "but respect isn't demanded. It's earned, and I will earn it, with time and work. You just need to trust me." Augustus extended his hand across the table, palm up. Helen looked at it, and then placed her own hand in his. "I trust you," he said. "And if you're enjoying the story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's get to the most emotional moment." It was the following week that everything changed for good. Helen was in the cottage on a rainy afternoon, mending one of the dresses, when she heard urgent knocking at the door, opened it, and found Theodore soaked, hat dripping water. "Miss Helen," he said, panting, "need to come quick. Boss had an accident." Helen felt the world stop. "What? Where?" "He was checking the north fence," explained Theodore. "Horse stepped in a hole and he fell. Hit his head on a rock, bleeding bad." Helen didn't think, grabbed her cape and ran after Theodore, who was already heading to the barn. They mounted horses and galloped through the rain, cold water hitting Helen's face, but she barely felt it. Thought only of getting to Augustus. Found him leaning against a tree, holding a bloody cloth to his head. 2 hands were with him, looking worried. When Augustus saw Helen, his eyes widened. "Helen, what are you doing here?" She dismounted and ran to him, kneeling in the mud. "Let me see," she asked. He moved the cloth, revealing a deep cut above the eyebrow, bleeding a lot, as head wounds always do. But Helen forced herself to stay calm. "Needs stitches," she said, "and needs to be cleaned properly, or it could get infected. We have to take him back." The hands helped Augustus mount, but he was too dizzy to hold the reins properly. Helen mounted behind him, holding him firm, while Theodore led the horse slowly back to the farm. In the main house, Helen took command. "Mrs. Higgins, boiled water and clean cloths. Theodore, go get Dr. Mendez." Everyone moved to obey. She helped Augustus up to his room, something she had never done before. It was a masculine and simple room, with a large dark wood bed and Spartan furniture. Helen sat him on the bed and began cleaning the wound with care. Augustus watched her through the haze of pain. "You didn't need to come," he said. "You're soaked, gonna get sick." "Hush," said Helen without harshness, "and stay still." She worked with efficiency she learned from her mother, cleaning the wound, applying pressure until the bleeding stopped. When Dr. Mendez arrived half an hour later, he examined her work and nodded approvingly. "Did everything right," he said to Helen. "Now just need to give the stitches. Can you hold him? Sometimes grown men behave worse than children with needles." Helen held Augustus's hand while the doctor stitched the wound, felt his fingers squeeze hers every time the needle went through skin, but he didn't complain. Stayed looking at her the whole time, and there was something in his eyes that made her forget to breathe. When the doctor finished and left with instructions for rest, Helen realized she was still holding Augustus's hand. Tried to let go, but he wouldn't let her. "Stay," he asked. "Just a little longer. My head is spinning, and your presence helps." Helen should have left. It wasn't appropriate to be there, in his room, alone, but couldn't refuse. Sat on the edge of the bed, still holding his hand. They stayed like that for long minutes, in silence. Then Augustus spoke with a low voice. "Thought I was going to die for a moment, when I fell and hit my head. And do you know what my first thought was?" Helen shook her head. "What?" "That I hadn't told you how much you mean to me. That I was going to leave without you knowing." Helen felt tears fill her eyes. "Don't talk like that," she said. "You're fine. It was just an accident." Augustus pulled her hand, bringing her closer. "But it made me realize we can't wait for the perfect time. There is no perfect time. There is only now and what we choose to do with it." He sat up with effort despite Helen's protests, getting even closer. "Helen," he said with intensity, "I don't care anymore what people say. I don't care if it's too soon or if society doesn't approve. I know what I feel. I love you, love your strength, your kindness, the way you love my son. Love how you make me want to be a better man. And I know it's early, know there's much to resolve, but I can't keep this inside anymore. You need to know." Helen was crying openly now. "Me too," she whispered. "I love you too. Tried not to love, tried to keep distance, but I can't. You made me feel I still have value when I thought I lost everything. Made me feel seen, not just for your charity, but for who I really am." And Augustus kissed her. Not a chaste kiss on the forehead like before. It was a real kiss, deep, loaded with all the feeling they had been keeping. Helen responded, her hands going up to his face, careful of the wound, but not wanting to let go. When they finally separated, both were breathless. "Marry me," said Augustus. "Not now, not tomorrow. But when you are ready, when we have done this the right way, the way you deserve, I want you to be my wife, Helen. Want to build a life with you." Helen could barely believe she was hearing that. "But what about people?" she asked. "The gossip?" Augustus smiled for the first time since the accident. "Let them talk. We'll prove them wrong. We'll do this right with a public engagement, proper mourning time respected, everything as it should be. But in the end, you will be my wife. If you accept." "I accept," said Helen without hesitating. "Yes, I accept." They kissed again, and for the first time since Helen lost everything in the fire, she felt she had a home again. Not a physical place, but a person. Augustus was her home now, just as she was his. The following months were of transformation. Augustus announced the engagement publicly in town, facing stares and comments with firm dignity. Explained Helen's story, what happened to her family, how she arrived at the farm. Spoke of her not as an object of charity, but as a woman of value who earned his respect and love. And slowly, very slowly, the community's attitude began to change. It helped that Helen worked tirelessly. Besides teaching Martin, she started offering literacy classes to the children of farm tenants. On Saturdays, she received the children in the library and taught them to read. The mothers of these children came to see her differently, not as an intruder or opportunist, but as a person who contributed, who gave without expecting return. The wedding happened on a sunny day in October, 6 months after the engagement. It was a simple ceremony in the farm chapel with the priest from town officiating. Helen wore a simple white dress Mrs. Higgins helped sew, and on her feet were the leather shoes Theodore made months before, now worn from use, but still sturdy. Martin was the one who walked Helen to Augustus at the altar, the boy radiant in his role. And when the priest declared them husband and wife, even the gossiping women who initially criticized had to admit they made a beautiful couple. Life at Cedar Ridge Farm gained new color. Helen wasn't just a teacher or guest anymore. She was the lady of the house, wife and mother to Martin, who called her Mom naturally and with love. She transformed the library into a small school, formalizing lessons for children in the region. Augustus built an annex, especially for it, with a large blackboard and desks. Within a year, Helen was teaching 20 children regularly. She also made changes to the house. Didn't erase Caroline's memory, but added her own presence. New paintings on the walls, a medicinal herb garden in the back, small touches that made the place feel more alive. And Augustus blossomed with her. The closed and sad man she met transformed into someone who smiled easily, who played with his son, who hugged her by the waist when she was cooking and whispered how much he loved her. Evelyn returned for a visit a year after the wedding. Helen was apprehensive, but the sister-in-law arrived with a different attitude. She still had reservations, it was obvious. But when she saw Martin happy and talkative, reading whole books to her and solving complex math problems, she had to recognize Helen's value. And when she saw Augustus truly happy, for the first time since her sister's death, something in her gave way. On the eve of her departure, Evelyn called Helen for a private talk. I was hard on you, she admitted. Unjust. Saw you as a threat to Caroline's memory. But I see now you aren't. My sister would want Augustus to be happy. Would want Martin to have a loving mother. You give both those things. Won't say I understand completely, or that it doesn't hurt to see another face where I saw hers. But I recognize you do good for this family, and for that, I thank you. Helen accepted the peace offered with grace. I didn't come to replace her, said Helen. I came because I had no choice. But I stayed because I chose to love. And I love this family. Evelyn nodded, and for the first time smiled at Helen, a genuine smile, albeit small. 2 years after the wedding, Helen gave birth to a girl they named Amelia in honor of Helen's mother. And 3 years later came another boy, Paul. The main house filled with sounds of children, laughter, life. Martin grew strong and intelligent, going to study in Dallas at 15, but always coming back on holidays full of stories and maintaining deep ties with Helen, whom he considered his true mother. Helen's small school grew so much. Augustus built a larger building, hired another teacher to help. Children came from miles around to study there. And Helen, who arrived barefoot and with nothing, became respected not just as Augustus's wife, but for her own merit. She was Teacher Helen, the woman who taught with patience and love, who never turned a child away, whether poor or rich. On a Sunday afternoon, 15 years after that day, she arrived bloodying the road with wounded feet. Helen was on the porch of the main house, watching her children play in the garden. Amelia was trying to teach Paul to read, imitating her mother in everything. Martin, now a young man of 20, was visiting with his fiancée. The farm prospered, the school had 40 students, and life was full in a way Helen never imagined possible in those dark days after the fire. Augustus came out of the house and joined her, putting his arm around her waist. He was 53 now, hair whiter, but eyes still shone when he looked at her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Helen leaned into him. "The shoes," she replied. Augustus laughed. "Still think about them?" Helen nodded. "Every day. It was the first moment I felt I mattered, that I wasn't just a problem to be solved, but a person to be seen. You gave me dignity before you gave me love. And that made all the difference." Augustus turned her to face him. "You gave me life back," he said, "when I was ready to just exist until I died. Showed me love can come twice in a life, in different ways, but no less real." Helen kissed him softly. "We were gifts to each other at the right time," she said. "When we both needed healing," and Augustus agreed, holding her closer. That night, after the big dinner with the whole family, Helen went into Augustus's office where he kept precious objects. On a special shelf, framed in glass, were the original leather shoes Theodore made so long ago. They were worn now, sole thin from use, leather cracked in some places. But they were beautiful. They were a symbol of everything they had built. Of the moment dignity and love met on a farm in rural Georgia, and transformed 2 broken lives into a whole and happy family. Helen touched the glass lightly. "Thank you," she whispered, not knowing quite who she was thanking. Maybe fate that brought her there. Maybe the memory of her parents who taught her never to give up. Maybe Augustus, who saw in her more than appearances suggested. Or maybe herself, for having had the courage to accept help when she needed it, and love when it was offered. Augustus appeared behind her, arms wrapping around her. "Those shoes saved my life," said Helen softly. "Not just my feet, my whole life. Because when you knelt and measured my feet that day, you showed me I still had value, that I deserved care, and that gave me strength to continue." Augustus kissed the top of her head. "You always had value," he said. "I was just lucky to recognize it." Years later, when Helen was a grandmother of 7 grandchildren and the school had expanded to have 3 teachers, she still told the story of the shoes to whoever wanted to hear. told it to her granddaughters when they asked how she and Grandpa met, told it to older students when teaching about dignity and self-respect, told it to new tenants arriving at the farm seeking opportunity, showing everyone deserves a chance. And she always ended the story the same way. True love, she said, isn't the one that rescues you. It's the one that sees you when you're broken and chooses to honor you anyway. That gives you tools to rebuild yourself instead of carrying you. That offers dignity before offering affection, because dignity is a foundation. Without it, everything crumbles. But with it, you can build anything, even a whole new life. Helen Hawthorne lived to be 82, surrounded by a large and loving family. When she passed, she went in peace, knowing she left a legacy. The school she founded continued for generations. Her children and grandchildren honored her memory, keeping alive the values she taught. And the shoes, those simple leather shoes Theodore made with such care decades before, remained at the farm. Were eventually donated to the small local museum, where they stayed on display with a plaque telling the story. The story of how a simple gesture of respect changed everything, of how measuring someone's feet was, in truth, recognizing their complete humanity. And so Helen, who arrived barefoot and with nothing on a hot afternoon in August, left a permanent mark, not because she married a man of means, but because she lived with dignity, loved with courage, and taught everyone around her that every person, no matter how broken or lost, deserves to be seen, deserves to be honored, deserves to have their feet measured and custom shoes made. Because everyone, absolutely everyone, deserves to walk through life with dignity.